Charles Whittaker stepped off the plane in London with a sense of entitlement that seemed to fill the entire airport. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, he carried himself as if the world revolved around him. Clad in an expensive suit and shiny leather shoes, Charles looked every bit like the wealthy businessman he was. But beneath the polished exterior lay a man who thrived on stirring trouble. Back home in America, he had earned a reputation for being loud, opinionated, and often disrespectful, especially toward people he deemed below him. Yet, somehow, he always managed to escape serious consequences. Money and connections had shielded him from accountability more times than he could count. This trip to London was supposed to be different, or so his wife, Margaret, and teenage daughter, Emily, hoped. They'd begged him to leave his usual antics behind, but deep down, they knew better. Charles wasn't one to change. As soon as they landed, he began complaining about everything. The long flight, the British accent, it's just weird, and even the weather, which was predictably overcast. Margaret sighed, clutching her purse tightly, while Emily rolled her eyes, already dreading the week ahead. The family checked into a luxurious hotel near Buckingham Palace, their first stop on the itinerary. Charles strutted through the lobby, loudly announcing his excitement to see the famous royal guards. "Let's go see those guys who stand still all day like statues," he said with a smirk, earning disapproving glances from other guests. Margaret tried to hush him, but it was no use. Charles loved attention, whether good or bad, and today was no exception. When they arrived at the palace gates, Charles immediately zeroed in on the guards stationed outside. Their bright red uniforms and bearskin hats fascinated the crowd, but Charles found them ridiculous. He snickered loudly, pointing at one guard in particular. "Look at this guy, standing there like a robot. What's the point?" he exclaimed, drawing stares from nearby tourists. Some chuckled nervously, while others shook their heads, clearly unimpressed by his rudeness. Margaret tugged at his arm, whispering, "Can you please keep your voice down? People are staring." But Charles brushed her off, leaning closer to the guard instead. "Hey, buddy, you ever get tired of standing there looking silly?" he called out, grinning mischievously. The guard didn't flinch, maintaining perfect composure despite the provocation. This only fueled Charles' amusement. "Wow, not even a blink. Come on, don't you have anything to say?" His behavior drew a mix of reactions from the crowd. A group of teenagers giggled, recording videos of the spectacle, while older visitors muttered disapprovingly under their breath. One elderly woman turned to her companion and said, "What a disgraceful man." Charles either didn't hear or didn't care. To him, this was all just harmless fun, a chance to show off and prove how untouchable he truly was. As the minutes ticked by, Charles grew bolder. Spotting a souvenir shop nearby, he wandered inside and purchased a small can of red spray paint, joking to himself about how easy it would be to spice things up. Little did anyone know, this impulsive purchase would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. With the small can of red spray paint tucked into his pocket, Charles returned to the scene outside Buckingham Palace, a smug grin spreading across his face. The royal guards stood as still as statues, their stoic expressions unchanging despite the growing crowd around them. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed excitedly, and some visitors whispered in awe about the history and tradition these men represented. But Charles saw none of that. To him, the guards were nothing more than props for his amusement, a chance to show off his so-called wit and prove how untouchable he believed himself to be. He approached the same guard he'd been taunting earlier, this time with renewed confidence. "Still not talking, huh?" he jeered, leaning closer until his nose was practically brushing the guard's bearskin hat. "What's the matter? Too scared to say something? Or maybe you're just too dumb?" His voice carried over the murmurs of the crowd, drawing even more attention. Some people laughed nervously, unsure if they should find his antics funny or disturbing. Others glared at him openly, shaking their heads in disapproval. Margaret and Emily lingered a few feet away, visibly uncomfortable. Margaret tugged at her husband's sleeve again, pleading quietly, "Charles, please stop. You're embarrassing us." But Charles ignored her, waving her off with an impatient flick of his hand. "Relax, Maggie," he said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "It's just a little harmless fun. These guys are paid to stand here like robots anyway. They don't care." But the guard did care, or at least it felt that way to those watching. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, though his eyes remained fixed straight ahead, betraying no emotion. This tiny reaction only egged Charles on further. He stepped back dramatically, spreading his arms wide, as if addressing an invisible audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone dripping with mockery. "Behold the mighty protector of England." Not a word, not a move, just standing there like a mannequin in a fancy costume. The crowd shifted uneasily, some people starting to back away while others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. A young couple exchanged worried glances, whispering to each other about whether someone should intervene. Even the palace security officers stationed nearby began to take notice, their postures stiffening as they watched the escalating situation unfold. Then came the moment that would seal Charles' fate. With a theatrical flourish, he pulled the can of red spray paint from his pocket and held it up for everyone to see. "You know what this needs," he declared, wiggling the can playfully. "A little color. Let's give this guy something to remember me by." Before anyone could react, he pressed the nozzle and sprayed a thick streak of bright red paint across the front of the guard's immaculate uniform. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Children froze mid-laugh, parents clutched their cameras tighter, and several onlookers shouted angrily at Charles. "Are you insane?" One woman yelled, her voice trembling with outrage. Another man stepped forward, pointing a finger at him. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? That's a disgrace." For a split second, Charles seemed startled by the intensity of the reaction. But then his smirk returned, wider and more defiant than before. He turned to the crowd, hands raised as if basking in applause. "Come on, lighten up," he said, laughing awkwardly. "It's just paint. No harm done, right?" Wrong. As the weight of what he'd done began to sink in, palace security sprang into action. 2 officers rushed toward Charles, their faces grim with determination. The once amused tourists now formed a tight circle around him, filming every humiliating second as he was swiftly surrounded. For the first time since arriving in London, Charles Whittaker realized he might not be as untouchable as he thought. The moment palace security officers laid hands on Charles, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. What had started as a chaotic spectacle quickly turned into a scene of swift and decisive action. 2 burly guards grabbed Charles by the arms, their grips firm and unyielding. He struggled briefly, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of reality. "Hey, let go of me," he shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "This is ridiculous. It was just a joke." But no one was laughing now. The crowd that had once watched his antics with a mix of amusement and irritation now stared at him with cold, unforgiving eyes. Some shook their heads in disgust, while others clapped in approval as the officers dragged him away from the scene. A young woman holding her phone aloft muttered loudly enough for those around her to hear, "Serves him right." Her comment drew murmurs of agreement from nearby spectators. As Charles disappeared behind the palace gates, flanked by stern-faced security personnel, the viral nature of his actions began to take shape. Within minutes, videos of the incident flooded social media platforms. Clips capturing every detail, from Charles' initial taunts to the shocking act of vandalism, were shared millions of times across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Hashtags like #RespectTheGuard and #TouristGoneWild trended worldwide, sparking heated debates about privilege, entitlement, and cultural insensitivity. Back at the hotel, Margaret and Emily sat glued to their laptops, watching the story unfold in real time. News outlets picked up the footage, replaying it endlessly alongside commentary from experts and eyewitnesses. One clip showed Charles smirking as he sprayed paint on the guard's uniform. Another zoomed in on the horrified expressions of onlookers. The images were impossible to ignore, and devastating for the Whittaker family. Margaret buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by shame and disbelief. How could he do this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Emily, sitting beside her, scrolled through endless posts filled with vitriol directed at her father. Comment after comment labeled him as spoiled American, a bully, and worse. For every person defending his actions as a harmless prank gone wrong, dozens more condemned him for his blatant disrespect. "It's not fair," Emily said softly, though even she couldn't muster much sympathy for Charles. She'd spent years enduring his loud, overbearing behavior, but this was something else entirely. Watching strangers tear him apart online made her feel both guilty and relieved. Guilty because he was still her father, and relieved because maybe, just maybe, this would finally force him to face consequences for his actions. Meanwhile, news anchors and talk show hosts dissected the incident from every angle. Pundits debated whether Charles' behavior stemmed from ignorance or malice, while historians emphasized the importance of respecting traditions like the Royal Guards. One particularly scathing segment featured a British comedian mocking Charles' accent and demeanor, quipping, "Maybe next time he'll try spray painting Big Ben or throwing tea at the Queen's portrait." By the end of the day, Charles' face had become synonymous with arrogance and recklessness. His name trended globally, accompanied by memes and jokes that painted him as the poster child for entitled tourists. Even back home in America, the backlash was immediate and brutal. Friends and colleagues who once tolerated his abrasive personality distanced themselves, deleting old photos with him and issuing public statements condemning his actions. Business partners scrambled to cut ties, fearing association with someone whose reputation had been reduced to rubble overnight. For Margaret and Emily, the humiliation was unbearable. They fielded calls from reporters seeking statements, declined interviews, and avoided leaving their hotel room altogether. Every notification on their phones brought fresh reminders of how deeply Charles' actions had impacted not only his own life, but theirs as well. As they packed their bags in preparation to return home early, Margaret looked at Emily and said quietly, "We can't keep living like this. Something has to change." And deep down, they both knew exactly what, or rather, who, that meant. The trial of Charles Whittaker became a media sensation, drawing reporters and onlookers from around the world. Held in a London courtroom packed with journalists, photographers, and curious citizens, the proceedings unfolded under intense scrutiny. Charles, dressed in an ill-fitting suit that hung awkwardly on his now-slouched frame, looked nothing like the confident man who had strutted through Buckingham Palace days earlier. His usual bravado was replaced by nervous fidgeting as he sat beside his high-profile defense attorney, a man known for getting wealthy clients out of sticky situations. The prosecution wasted no time painting Charles as a reckless and disrespectful tourist who had shown blatant disregard for British traditions and authority. They presented video evidence of the incident, playing it multiple times to emphasize the shock and outrage of the crowd. Witnesses were called to testify. Tourists who had been present that day described how Charles' behavior escalated from taunting to outright vandalism. One elderly woman recounted how she felt sickened watching him deface the guard's uniform, calling it an insult not just to the individual but to the institution he represented. Security footage from the palace grounds further sealed Charles' fate. It showed him purchasing the spray paint moments before the incident, proving premeditation rather than a spur-of-the-moment prank. The prosecutor argued that this wasn't simply a harmless act of rebellion. It was calculated disrespect aimed at undermining the dignity of the Royal Guards. Charles' lawyer tried to downplay the severity of the offense, framing it as a cultural misunderstanding. "My client is not familiar with the deep reverence Britons hold for their royal traditions," he explained, appealing to the judge's sense of fairness. He emphasized that Charles came from a country where freedom of speech and expression, were highly valued, suggesting that his actions were misinterpreted as malicious when they were merely misguided. To bolster their case, the defense also highlighted Charles' lack of prior criminal record, at least officially. However, this strategy backfired when the prosecution countered by digging into his past. They uncovered numerous incidents involving aggressive behavior toward service workers, racially insensitive remarks made during business meetings, and even accusations of bullying subordinates at work. These revelations painted a damning picture of a man whose arrogance knew no bounds. As the trial progressed, public opinion continued to weigh heavily against Charles. Social media buzzed with updates from the courtroom, and hashtags like #JusticeForTheGuard gained momentum once again. People shared memes mocking his attempts to defend himself, while others expressed relief that someone so seemingly untouchable was finally being held accountable. Even British tabloids ran headlines declaring, "The day the joke went too far." During cross-examination, Charles took the stand reluctantly, visibly uncomfortable under the spotlight. When asked why he thought it was acceptable to vandalize a guard's uniform, he stammered, I didn't mean any harm. I thought it would be funny. You know, lighten things up." His tone wavered between defensive and dismissive, which only angered the judge further. At one point, the prosecutor leaned in close and asked pointedly, "Did you consider how your actions might affect the person wearing that uniform? Or did you see them as less than human because of their role?" Charles hesitated, unable to give a satisfactory answer. Instead, he muttered something about not thinking it through, which drew audible groans from the gallery. By the end of his testimony, it was clear that his attempt to appear remorseful fell flat. To everyone in the room, he still seemed arrogant and unrepentant, a man convinced that rules didn't apply to him. When the verdict was finally delivered, there was a collective intake of breath. The judge declared Charles guilty on all counts: criminal damage, public disorder, and assault on a member of the armed forces. In a stern voice, she condemned his actions as an affront to the values of respect and decorum upheld by this nation. She sentenced him to 6 months in prison and imposed a hefty fine, ensuring that the punishment matched the gravity of the offense. As Charles was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. For the first time since arriving in London, he was utterly silent, his face pale and drawn. Outside, crowds cheered at the news, celebrating what many saw as a rare victory for accountability over privilege. Back home in America, the fallout intensified. Friends turned their backs, businesses severed ties, and Margaret filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Emily refused to speak to him, leaving Charles truly alone for the first time in his life. The moment Charles stepped into the prison, his world shrank to the size of a cold gray cell. Gone were the luxuries he had taken for granted, his spacious home, tailored suits, and expensive dinners. Instead, he found himself surrounded by harsh fluorescent lights, metal bars, and the constant hum of murmured conversations and distant shouting. The air smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant, a stark contrast to the polished hotels and restaurants he was used to frequenting. On his first day, Charles quickly realized that his reputation had preceded him. News of the American tourist who sprayed paint on a royal guard had spread even behind bars. Inmates whispered about him as he walked past, their eyes following him with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Some called him Paint Guy, while others mocked his accent, imitating his loud, obnoxious tone from the viral videos. Charles tried to ignore them, clutching the small bundle of belongings he'd been allowed to bring inside, but the weight of their stares made it impossible to feel anything but exposed. Things only got worse during mealtime. Standing in line for bland food served on plastic trays, Charles felt the tension building around him. When he reached the front, an inmate shoved him aside, snatching the last piece of bread before he could grab it. Charles opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it when he saw the man scowl. Wordlessly, he took his tray and looked for a place to sit. Every table seemed full or deliberately avoided making space for him. Eventually, He settled in a corner, eating quickly and keeping his head down. Sleeping was no easier. His cellmate, a burly man named Derek with tattoos covering his arms, barely acknowledged him at first. But when Charles accidentally knocked over Derek's toothbrush while unpacking, the larger man erupted into a tirade. "Watch what you're doing, rich boy," Derek growled, looming over him. Charles stammered an apology, backing away until his back hit the wall. From that moment on, he tiptoed around Derek, terrified of provoking another outburst. As weeks passed, Charles became increasingly isolated. Other inmates targeted him for theft, taking whatever little money or snacks his family sent him. One night, someone stole his blanket, leaving him shivering through the chilly hours until morning. He complained to the guards, but they offered little help, shrugging off his grievances with indifference. To them, he was just another prisoner, one who happened to have insulted something sacred to their country. Desperate for protection, Charles began offering bribes to some of the tougher inmates, handing over cash or promising favors once he was released. At first, this strategy worked. A few men started treating him slightly better, shielding him from the worst of the bullying. But soon, rumors spread that he was paying for safety, and others demanded the same. Charles found himself trapped in a cycle of giving more and more, yet never feeling truly secure. His mental state deteriorated rapidly. Once arrogant and self-assured, Charles now flinched at loud noises and avoided eye contact with anyone. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the events that had led him here. For the first time in his life, he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. There were no lawyers to bail him out, no friends to smooth things over, and no wealth to shield him from hardship. He was utterly alone. By the end of his sentence, Charles was a shadow of his former self. The confident man who had strutted through Buckingham Palace was gone, replaced by someone who shuffled awkwardly, avoiding attention at all costs. His cheeks were hollow, his hair unkempt, and his posture slouched. A physical manifestation of the toll prison had taken on him. As he prepared to leave, one guard remarked dryly, "Maybe next time you'll think twice before disrespecting traditions." Charles didn't respond. He simply nodded, clutching the small bag containing his few remaining possessions, and walked out into the unknown. Though his time in prison was over, the scars it left behind would linger far longer than the 6 months he served. Stepping out of prison on a chilly morning, Charles Whittaker felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The fresh air should have been a relief after months of stale, recycled oxygen inside the penitentiary, but it only highlighted how much had changed. He stood there for a moment, blinking under the pale sunlight, clutching the same crumpled duffel bag he'd carried into prison 6 months earlier. It was lighter now, not just because it held fewer belongings, but because everything that once defined him seemed to have slipped away. Back in America, Charles expected some semblance of normalcy. Surely his old life would welcome him back with open arms, right? Wrong. The reality hit him almost immediately. His phone, which he'd barely touched since being locked up, buzzed incessantly as notifications poured in. Most were hate messages from strangers who still recognized his name and faced thanks to the viral incident. "Hope you rot," one read. Another said, "You got what you deserved." Each word stung more than the last, not because they were clever or creative, but because they were true. His attempts to rebuild his professional life ended in disaster. Former business partners refused to return his calls, and clients who once valued his expertise now dismissed him outright. One email summed it up perfectly. "We can't afford to associate with someone whose reputation is so toxic." Even companies he'd never worked with rejected him after background checks flagged his criminal record. For the first time in decades, Charles found himself unemployable, a man with no purpose and nowhere to turn. At home, or rather, the tiny apartment he'd rented after selling off most of his assets, Charles tried to piece together some semblance of dignity, but isolation gnawed at him constantly. Margaret and Emily had moved across the country, starting new lives without him. They didn't answer his calls or respond to his letters, leaving him stranded in a sea of loneliness. Friends who used to laugh at his jokes stopped inviting him to gatherings. Neighbors whispered behind his back whenever he ventured outside, their eyes lingering on his haggard appearance. Desperate to salvage his image, Charles decided to take matters into his own hands. He reached out to a popular daytime talk show, pitching himself as a guest willing to discuss his mistakes and express remorse. The producers agreed, sensing an opportunity to boost ratings with a controversial figure. On the day of the interview, Charles dressed carefully, trying to project confidence despite the dark circles under his eyes. As he sat across from the host, cameras rolling and studio lights glaring down on him, he forced a smile and spoke about learning lessons and understanding cultural differences. But something about his delivery rang hollow. His apologies sounded rehearsed, his expressions flat. When the host pressed him, "Do you really regret what you did, or are you just sorry you got caught?" Charles faltered. He mumbled something vague about not thinking clearly, but the damage was done. Viewers saw through his act, flooding social media with comments calling him insincere and manipulative. Critics pointed out that his tone hadn't changed. He still seemed to view himself as the victim rather than the perpetrator. Even charitable organizations turned their backs on him when he offered donations in an effort to improve his public image. "Your money won't fix the harm you caused," one director told him bluntly over the phone. "People don't want your charity, they'd want accountability." As weeks turned into months, Charles retreated further into solitude. He spent his days watching TV, flipping aimlessly between news channels and sitcoms that felt worlds apart from his grim reality. At night, he drank cheap beer, hoping the haze would dull the ache of regret gnawing at his chest. The luxurious lifestyle he'd once taken for granted was gone, replaced by dingy furniture, instant noodles, and endless silence. One evening, scrolling idly through his laptop, Charles stumbled upon an article titled, "The Guard Who Stood Tall." It featured an interview with the very soldier he humiliated at Buckingham Palace. The guard, now promoted to a higher rank, spoke proudly about his career and the values of discipline and honor. Photos showed him smiling alongside colleagues, celebrated as a symbol of resilience and professionalism. Reading those words, Charles felt a pang of envy and guilt. While the guard's life had flourished despite the humiliation, Charles' own existence had unraveled completely. He closed the laptop, leaned back on the couch, and stared at the cracked ceiling above. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly reflect on what he'd lost, not just material possessions, but respect, relationships, and any chance at redemption. Though he tried to convince himself otherwise, deep down, Charles knew the truth. His arrogance had cost. Years passed, and Charles Whittaker faded into obscurity. A man once infamous, now reduced to a shadow of his former self. He lived in a cramped, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of town, far removed from the bustling streets and shiny skyscrapers he used to navigate with ease. The walls were bare except for a few cracks that seemed to grow wider with each passing month, mirroring the fractures in his own life. His days blended together in a monotonous haze, waking up late, watching television until his eyes glazed over, and drinking endless cups of instant coffee to fill the silence. Occasionally, curiosity, or perhaps masochism, would drive him to search his name online. At first, he did it often, hoping to find evidence that people had moved on or forgotten about him. But the internet never forgets. Articles about the Buckingham Palace incident still popped up in search results, accompanied by grainy photos of him smirking as he sprayed paint on the guard's uniform. Comment sections remained active, with new readers discovering the story and piling on fresh criticism. "This guy is the worst," one recent commenter wrote. Another added, "He ruined his own life because he couldn't control his ego." Each time Charles scrolled through these posts, he told himself they didn't matter. "It's just noise," he muttered under his breath, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. Yet the words lingered in his mind long after the screen went dark. They reminded him daily of how irreparably broken his life had become, and how much of it was his own doing. One quiet afternoon, while aimlessly browsing the web, Charles stumbled upon an article commemorating the anniversary of the incident. Titled 5 Years Later, How One Act of Disrespect Changed Lives Forever. It revisited the events at Buckingham Palace and examined their lasting impact. What caught Charles' attention most, however, wasn't the detailed recounting of his actions. It was the focus on the royal guard involved. The article described how the guard had risen through the ranks, earning accolades for his composure during the ordeal. Photos showed him smiling warmly at formal ceremonies, shaking hands with dignitaries, and mentoring younger recruits. Charles stared at the screen, his chest tightening with emotions he couldn't fully articulate. Envy clawed at him, the kind born not of admiration, but of regret. Here was a man who had faced public humiliation and emerged stronger, using the experience as fuel for growth. Meanwhile, Charles sat alone in his dingy apartment, drowning in bitterness and self-pity. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what might have been if he had handled things differently, if he had shown even a fraction of the grace and resilience displayed by the guard. The article also highlighted interviews with eyewitnesses from that day, many of whom expressed continued outrage over Charles' behavior. One woman recounted how she traveled all the way from Australia to witness the majesty of the royal guards, only to leave feeling disillusioned after witnessing Charles' antics. It wasn't just disrespect toward the guard, she said. It felt like a slap in the face to everyone who values tradition and hard work. Reading her words, Charles felt a flicker of shame, but quickly shoved it aside, convincing himself that others were exaggerating his impact. Still, the guilt gnawed at him. Late at night, when the world outside fell silent, Charles would lie awake replaying the incident in his mind. He saw the guard standing stoically, the crowd gasping in horror, and his own smug expression staring back at him like a stranger's. Sometimes, he wondered what he could have done differently, what tiny choice might have spared him this endless cycle of loneliness and regret. But no matter how many scenarios he imagined, the outcome always came back to the same truth. His arrogance had blinded him, leading him down a path with no return. By morning, though, Charles reverted to his usual defenses. He convinced himself that the world was unfair, that people enjoyed kicking someone when they were already down. "I made a mistake," he whispered to the empty room. "But does anyone care that I suffered enough?" Of course, there was no answer, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside his window. As the years dragged on, Charles became a ghost, not just to society, but to himself. He avoided mirrors, unable to face the tired, hollow-eyed man staring back at him. Friends and family were gone, replaced by strangers who either didn't recognize him or chose to ignore him altogether. Even Margaret and Emily refused to reconnect, despite his occasional attempts to reach out via email or handwritten letters. Their silence spoke volumes, cutting deeper than any insult ever could. And so, Charles drifted through life, existing rather than living. He clung to small comforts, a warm cup of coffee. On a rainy afternoon, Charles sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the rhythmic patter of raindrops against the window providing the only soundtrack to this solitude. The article about the royal guard still glowed faintly on his laptop screen, though he had stopped reading it hours ago. Instead, he stared blankly at the wall, his mind replaying fragments of his life before and after that fateful day at Buckingham Palace. Each memory felt like a shard of glass, sharp and painful, cutting deeper with every passing thought. He thought about the man he used to be, the confident, larger-than-life figure who strutted through life convinced of his own superiority. That version of Charles would have scoffed at the idea of regret, dismissing it as weakness. But now, sitting in the quiet loneliness of his tiny apartment, Charles couldn't escape the weight of what he'd done. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly reflect, not just on the incident itself, but on the years of arrogance and entitlement that had led him there. What struck him most was how little he had actually lost compared to what he could have gained. Had he shown respect that day instead of ridicule, he might have walked away with stories of awe and admiration for the royal guards. He could have returned home with tales of tradition and history, sharing them proudly with Margaret and Emily. Instead, he had destroyed not only his reputation, but also the relationships that mattered most. His family's absence loomed over him like a storm cloud, a constant reminder of the bridges he'd burned. The irony wasn't lost on him either. The guard he had mocked and humiliated had gone on to thrive, celebrated for his discipline and resilience. Meanwhile, Charles, once wealthy, successful, and seemingly untouchable, was now a cautionary tale whispered about online or dismissed with a shake of the head. It wasn't justice, it was karma. And Charles knew it. As the rain continued to fall outside, he opened a dusty photo album he hadn't touched in years. Inside were pictures of happier times, vacations with Margaret and Emily, business dinners where he laughed heartily with colleagues, even candid shots of him posing awkwardly in front of landmarks during past travels. Looking at those images, Charles felt a pang of longing for the man he used to be and the life he had squandered. He wondered if Margaret and Emily ever looked at old photos too, and whether they missed the person he once was, or if they saw him as irredeemably broken. Eventually, Charles closed the album and turned off his laptop, leaving the room cloaked in shadows. He poured himself another cup of coffee, though he barely tasted it. Sitting by the window, he watched the rain streak down the glass, distorting the cityscape beyond. In that moment, he realized something profound. Redemption wasn't impossible, but it required more than apologies or excuses. It demanded change, real, meaningful change, and Charles wasn't sure he had the strength to pursue it. Still, as the evening wore on, a flicker of hope surfaced within him. Maybe it wasn't too late to start small, perhaps writing a sincere letter to Margaret and Emily without expecting forgiveness would be a step in the right direction, or volunteering at a local shelter, using whatever skills he had left to help others. These ideas felt fragile, like sparks struggling to ignite a fire, but they offered a sliver of purpose amidst the emptiness. By the time night fell, Charles drifted off to sleep, his thoughts quieter than they had been in years. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, washing away the grime from the streets below. Whether Charles could find the courage to clean his own life remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe it might be possible, if only he chose to try. And so, the story of Charles Whittaker ended not with triumph or resolution, but with a question hanging in the air. Could a man defined by arrogance learn humility? Only time would tell.